what's going on in Venezuela. We're going to talk about Ukraine, but before going there, let's talk about Venezuela because CNN reported yesterday that Venezuela announces massive mobilization of military forces as the United States' largest warship sails into region. And before coming up, you mentioned the situation with the case of the war in Iraq and the situation in the Middle East and in West Asia. We had the same in Libya. What is your point when it comes to the Latin America and the influence that any sort of war between the United States and Venezuela could bring to the region?
Yeah, it's going to be metastatic, right? It's going to be malignant. It's going to cause, at best, instability, if not outright warfare. You look at any example, and if someone can think of one where this didn't occur, please put it in the comments. But I can't think of any example. Vietnam, the effect it has in Southeast Asia, say particularly Cambodia and Laos, Iraq, in terms of the effect on, say, Syria, Afghanistan, the effect on Pakistan, just as well as just a turmoil throughout those regions. You just brought up Libya. What we're seeing occur right now in sub-Saharan Africa is a direct consequence of NATO's war in Libya in 2011. You look at what's happening in, say, Mali or Nigeria, with the armed groups there. The way in Mali, they're able to blockade the capital from getting fuel, right? I mean, a decade later, and the consequences of Libya are still reverberating, are still rippling and having, this malignant metastatic effect. So, you could see that happen in South America. I mean, they've already said it, right? Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the heir apparent to Maduro, if the United States is successful in getting him out of power. She has said, after you free us here in Venezuela, then you're going to free Nicaragua, and you're going to free Cuba, and the designs by the Americans to consolidate their power in the Western Hemisphere as the United States in this administration accepts the multipolar world in a way that the Biden administration never would. But this administration, still an empire, it's still imperial, but it understands the changing dynamics of the world and trying to reshape or reinvent or reimagine the American empire to take advantage of that, to still be the preeminent or dominant empire. Well, they've got to consolidate what's theirs, and that's the Western Hemisphere. So you could see the machinations that would be put into play once the Venezuela campaign reaches a certain phase. Okay, now we have to shift. Now, we saw this in Iraq. I mean, my first year in Iraq in 04, spring of 04, when I was part of the Coalition Provisional Authority, so the Jerry Bremmer's outfit, the colonial administration of Iraq by the American Defense Department. I got there April of 04, was it May, whatever it was. And so a little more than a year after the invasion, and you still had people at the CPA headquarters, so senior levels of American officials, who would speak in ways, who would say things like, the big decision is still whether we go right or left, meaning that in the spring of 04, you still had key people, senior people who were around senior people saying things like, are we going to Iran next, or are we going to Syria next? And that's what we're looking at here with Venezuela. Machado's already said it, like I said, but this idea that what would be next after Venezuela. The other aspect of that is, as we were discussing before, Nima, this idea of what would this do to embolden or strengthen other movements throughout Latin America that are in favor of American alliance, right? Or in favor of being America's vassal, or seeing America as a pathway to their own power. That's probably the best way to describe it. So this idea that, say, like where you are in Brazil, you've already had a coup. You have these issues with right-wing groups there, with assaults on your democracy. You could very well see groups, throughout Latin America saying, you know what, the reason why Venezuela occurred, the reason why the Americans got Maduro out of power is because the opposition was so fervent. The opposition made noise, right? So the idea being is that the Americans are not going to take a chance on this. They're not going to risk it, or they're not going to deem us worthwhile of their support unless we demonstrate that we are worthwhile of their support. So you have this possibility then that if the Venezuela regime change war or operations or whatever they're going to do comes into effect, other groups throughout Latin America will say, this is the way for us to get to power. We have to demonstrate to the Americans that we are strong enough, we're resourceful, or that we have the resources, we have the ability to be worth their investment in helping us overthrow whoever it is, whatever country they're in. So yeah, this idea that you could have this increased instability is demonstrated through historical experience. It's demonstrated through the very words that are being spoken by both those in Latin America and those in the United States, and then by just the rational aspects of it. Yeah, it makes sense that this would embolden or strengthen other groups throughout Latin America to try and get the United States support to gain power for themselves.
At this particular time, Matt, do you see any difference between the establishment and Donald Trump himself and his administration? Do you see
Um,
those? He came. You remember when Donald Trump was the presidential candidate, and he was arguing that the war in you mentioned the war in Iraq. He said that I was against the war in Iraq. That was totally false, and but he's doing the same. He's not that different. Is he part of the establishment right now?
he is. He's part of the ruling class. Yeah, that's for certain. He just comes from a different sector of it. He's viewed by the clique that has run Washington, D.C. for a number of decades as an outsider. Even after a term as the president, they saw him as an outsider. But a lot of this too is because he took control of the Republican Party. He came into the Republican Party via his presidential run in 2015. If people recall, he actually ran the previous time, didn't get very far in it in 2011, for the 2012 race. But 2015, he comes in, he defeats 15 other wannabes for the president. And the Republican Party fights him. And here we are 8 years later or so, and he is in control of the Republican Party. He made the Republican Party his. So you have an aggrieved section of the conservative base in the United States, or not the conservative establishment, the conservative elite in the United States that view themselves as being usurped. And this is expressed in the Never Trumpers and various things like that. We know mostly of the Never Trumpers from those who were part of the national security, foreign policy establishment who felt that they were being usurped, that in his first administration, Trump was not was removing from power those who were benefiting most from the status quo of the American national security machine, right? Of the status quo of America's imperial footprint. That those who were going to, and that's where you see so many of the original Never Trumpers coming from. But at this point, Trump has made the Republican Party his own. And so that many of those who are no longer in control or part of or receiving the largesse of being the Republican elite establishment are against Trump. Now that they're all part of the ruling class, though, right? They're all part of the elite or the establishment, or however you want to describe it. I mean, go back to the person who's probably influenced me most in my thinking on this, C. Wright Mills, a sociologist, a political scientist from the 1950s, who writes The Power Elite. And I encourage people to read that book. I think he wrote it in 57 or so, or 56. And if you read that book, you'll have a good understanding of how the United States operates now, how it functions, why decisions are made, how you can understand the ruling class to have divisions within it, but still be arm in arm, linked together on those things that are most important to the ruling class. So, Donald Trump does have a degree of separation from the Republican establishment as I've known it most of my life, as I understood it most of his life, but he is still part of the ruling class. and still have to, we'll throw George Carlin into the mix right now and say it's a big club and you ain't in it. So for me, you, all the group people watching this right now, we're not part of that ruling class. And so even though there are divisions within it, we have to understand it as the ruling class that has its own cliques and its own internal hierarchies and stuff, but is still distinct and different than the rest of us.
Mhm. I think you put it so cautiously and precisely. And Matt, let me uh, uh, shift the gear to the conflict in Ukraine, because as we know, Russia is advancing and Pokrovsk is falling. And what else can Donald Trump bring to the table in Ukraine that could somehow change the game? What else Europeans can do in Ukraine to change the reality of what's going on in Ukraine? Because as time goes by, you see just Ukraine is shrinking. They're not going to expand, they're going to shrink more and more. And what is your understanding on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, not just Покrovsk, but it's in Kupiansk. It's on other parts of the front line that the Russians continue their advance. You have this continual uh, disbelief or refutation, or by the West, that includes Ukraine, Europe, the Americans, the backers of this war, who deny that Russia is advancing. And oh no, Pokrovsk is not going to fall. The Russians haven't, and then all of a sudden it's encircled, right? And the Russians are in the middle of it. And yes, I mean that took 18 months or however long, but we also understand that the Russian objectives in this war are not terrain based, that they are goal oriented, they're objective oriented, and those objectives are not terrain. It's the destruction of the Ukrainian military, it's the destruction of the West's industrial capacity, to not the industrial capacity, but the continued destruction of everything the West produces. I believe in an attempt to make the West come to the realization that this is futile. You just had Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, the other day say that NATO is now producing more ammunition than Russia. I didn't see any details. I didn't see any evidence. Maybe they're producing more 5.56 rifle rounds. Something that the Russians themselves don't produce. It's some statistic that is true, but it's not true. But the failure of the West here to accept the reality, that the desire to remain beholden to this narrative, a narrative of the good war in Ukraine, right? A narrative of good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism. The thing that Joe Biden campaigns on. Let's remember that more than 2 years ago now, in September of 23, the Biden administration launches its first reelection campaign ad. And what is that ad? It is Joe Biden going to Ukraine. It's Joe Biden as a wartime president. We have to remember that the Democratic Party in the United States has used Russia as a boogeyman, has used the construct of Donald Trump equals Vladimir Putin, the Republicans equal Russia, as one of their main sources of identity, both who we are and who the Republicans are, for more than a decade now. That is very difficult to give up. That's very difficult to turn around on and say, this is no longer true. And I know the Democrats are no longer in power, but the same construct, the same narrative has been used throughout Europe, particularly in Germany and in Britain and France. It's very difficult for those political leaders to turn around and say, well, yeah, no, we really weren't too serious about this. We're going to make peace with the Russians now. They simply can't. They can't. And for many of them, it's the only thing that they're holding on to. Everything else is so terrible for them, whether it's issues of housing, the economy, healthcare, immigration, you name it. You have a Ukraine, of course, that is faltering, not just on the front lines, but economically, since things keep getting worse. There doesn't seem to be a way how they've come up with no way how they're going to fill this $70 billion budget gap to keep the government running, keep it, as well as the United States has provided more than $50 billion to keep the economy afloat. And this Trump administration is likely not going to do that. And the Europeans haven't figured out a way to backfill that. And then you have the politics of it all. I just reading before I came on with you, this big corruption scandal in Ukraine where the justice minister and the energy minister are now out because they were taking bribes and kickbacks with regards to and if anyone who's been following attention to Ukraine, paying attention to Ukraine these last 3 years, know that Ukraine is now going into its fourth winter where energy is a major issue for the Ukrainian people. They're freezing at night because the Russians were blowing up the energy sector. But now you've got this on top of it. You've got, the Russians have been targeting our energy infrastructure for years now, making it so that life is miserable and hard for us. And the people at the top, the people running our energy sector, our government ministers, have been getting fat and rich off of corruption related to it. So you just look at this and you say, my God, what a mess. And so to your point, and I'm finally getting to it, of course, but to your point about what can Donald Trump do? Well, I mean, one thing he could do is call Vladimir Putin and say, hey, Vlad, this offer that you made to extend the New START treaty, let's do it. If people aren't aware, more than a month ago now, the Russians said we'd like to extend a New START treaty, which is the last remaining major arms control treaty. This is what sets the caps on the number of deployed nuclear weapons each country has. It's very important. And more than a month ago now, the Russians said we'd like to extend it for 1 year to give us time to negotiate a further or renewed treaty or whatever. And at first, Donald Trump said, that sounds great. And since then, we have not heard over the course of weeks any response to the Russian offer. So the first thing that Donald Trump could do would be to do that, to at least start this process of high level, grand strategy, talks, high strategic level talks that the Russians want, that the Russians, when you go back to what is this Ukraine war all about, it comes back to their defense. It comes back to their national security interests. It comes back to this idea of American missiles in Romania and Poland, right? So the same things that, Khrushchev and Kennedy were dealing with, this is what we're talking about. That's the first thing Trump can do. And if he did that, if he began this process of addressing the Russians' national security, their legitimate national security issues, concerns, grievances, that I think would establish a degree of trust, a working relationship where other issues would then be able to be addressed. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening. I see this belief that we can keep the Ukraine war going. Eventually, the Ukrainians are going to start drafting their 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. That'll give us a half generation more of young men to feed into this furnace of war and keep it going. And Ruda is saying that we're producing more ammunition than the Russians are. See, it took some time. It took longer than we would like, but now our factories and our plants, they're in gear, and this is just we're going to be an arsenal of democracy here in Western Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We got to figure out how to get the Ukrainians the money they need to keep their government and their economy from collapsing like the house of cards that they are. So we just got to figure out how to properly steal that money from Russian foreign assets, frozen assets, excuse me. Right. So you could see the mania, just the insanity that is present here. And unfortunately, I don't see any resolution to it.